Okay, there we go. All right, so we do have board documentation on our gifted programming. So you can look on our website and find the coordination identification board documentation, as well as the BP 6172 on instructions and services. So basically it states that the governing board of Pasadena Unified believes that all students deserve an education that challenges them to reach their full potential, and the district shall provide gifted and talented students with opportunities for learning commensurate with their particular abilities and talents. So that's a part of it. So I like to start with, what are we saying when we're talking about gifted, and what are we saying when we're talking about talented, and how are those things determined? So when we're talking about, I like to use Gagne's definition. It came, he sort of defined it in 2007 first. But really what we're talking about when we're talking about the gift is that possession of untrained and spontaneously expressed natural ability in at least one domain. And what we're talking about, so that's that sort of, it hasn't really been developed yet, but you can see that potential there. And then when we're talking about the talent, it's that mastery of or of systemically developed abilities or knowledge in at least one field, okay? And in both of these areas, sometimes we're talking roughly about 10% of the population, right? Now, with the identification of a gift, there are many factors in seeing that gift. There are environmental factors, right? Students who are in homes where there's a lot more words being spoken, who are spoken with a lot, who have a lot of communication, might appear to have a different level of potential than other students. So we have to be aware of that. Students who maybe don't have those elements. There are also environmental factors just in terms of flat out, genes. Some of us, some people have, we're all born in different ways, and some of that comes through our genetic makeup. There are interpersonal factors. There's, that social and emotional level of how that might be seen. We have many students who are very quiet and very shy, especially maybe some of our language learners. And so that gift might not be as easily seen right away. And then there are developmental factors. It might be seen at different stages of their development. So all of these things layer into it. The easiest way to really think about the G and the T in this way is with sports. So, we see 3-year-olds that you see that are super coordinated, and they pick up a ball, and it seems like they were born to, play in that particular sport. But that doesn't mean that tomorrow they're going to be in the NBA or the NFL, right? That means that they have to develop that talent over time. It takes a lot of practice and development, but the gift is there, the raw gift you can see. Same with in artistic gifts. Sometimes it seems really obvious. We hear the 3-year-old and we recognize perfect pitch, for example, and we go, that's really interesting. But again, that doesn't mean that they're going to be, playing in a philharmonic in elementary school. So it takes time to develop that talent. But the same thing is true in terms of cognitive gifts. So the purpose of gate identification, as I kind of said, I mentioned at the beginning, is gifted students have special needs in our classroom, and their identification helps us to recognize their potential and differentiate instruction and services appropriately to meet their needs and develop their unique talents. So we have 3 areas in which we identify students in our district. Most here today, your students were identified under the intellectual category. The intellectual category is identified pretty clearly from our universal screener. Our secondary review process helps us to dig a little bit deeper and be able to see the creative identification category, as well as high achieving or specific academic identification category. We also identify intellectual through secondary review. It's not only through the universal screener, which is known as the test. I really stay away from using the term gate test, because this is not about one test that makes you gifted. We know that testing can be biased. We know that the testing is not perfect. So the test is just a universal screener. So we have baseline data to then go deeper on different levels with students to, again, identify that need. So I always go back to when I hear students, or when teachers aren't sure, or coaches or principals or our parents, and they say, well, sometimes people just want this label for some reason. I say, well, does your child have special needs in the classroom? Their divergent thinking, or based on their specific specific abilities. And if the answer is they're a really good student, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have special needs. So we want to differentiate instruction appropriately. So that's really what it's about. It's not, sometimes I make the reference to like the, to Dr. Seuss book, The Star-Bellied Sneetches. Like, it's not about, being better than anybody else. It's not about star on your belly. It's really about making sure that students' needs are being met and fostered in the classroom. So the way that the process works is that we do this universal screener. And again, the purpose is to provide a standardized baseline of cognitive potential in verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and nonverbal reasoning. Nonverbal reasoning is more of that, that creative element where it's a lot of spatial reasoning and that come through. And yeah, okay. And so that gives us data for the whole district. The initial identification of gifted intellectual is students are above the 90th percentile in 2 or more domains, or above the 95th percentile cumulatively. So the percentile, you think about it, it's like the giant bell curve, and it is age normed. So it goes by if your child was 8.2 years old or 9.3 years old, it goes down to the month, and it's age normed. So we're looking at that top 10th percentile in 2 or more domains. And we look at the, we also then at the same time do site level data analysis. So we look at local norms and we analyze it that way, as well as outlier scores in specific areas. So we see students who are 98th percentile in one area, 42nd in another, and 73rd in another. And so we might want to take another look at that student. We're not going to just immediately say that that's, we want to see what's going on in that with that student. So then we tag students for secondary, what is known as secondary review. And then we have 2 different layers to the secondary review process. One is a teacher observation tool that's used, and then another is a full portfolio review. So we take all of those things into consideration. And then of course, at any time, students or teachers can, and coaches at the school sites can say, hey, we would like to recommend a secondary review for this particular student. So it can go down, up. It doesn't have to just go up, down. The COGAT is just a universal screener. So we really believe that we are, engaging all students in this process. Many places across the state would say that they are being equitable just by universally screening, and I would disagree with them, because we know that the universal screener can be biased for some of our students. So, and in some districts, they don't even do a universal screener. It's only based on teacher recommendation, which of course could be biased as well. So we try to take an approach that really helps us to find those students who might have some special needs in our classroom. So I want to go into some myths versus reality in the area of gifted education. First of all, gifted kids are smart in every subject. First of all, I really try to stay away from that word. I like, it's a bad word to me, that S word, because it is a very fixed mindset word. And our gifted kids, if we're talking about how smart they are all the time when they're little, when things get to be really hard, they will start to lost their giftedness somehow, or they are suddenly not smart. So we really try to stay away from the word. I like to say, you know, wow, you really showed, that was really interesting, or I saw some really interesting growth there. I mean, there's lots of other ways that we can compliment students in their academic work. Also, if we're using that word and something really wasn't very hard for them, then they're like, I wonder, you know, how are we defining that term? So, and many times gifted kids don't even necessarily do well academically. They might have other challenges that get in their way. Another myth is that gifted students will learn on their own. Every child deserves the right to be supported in their education, and we all need help process. So having them, they can't just do things on their own that are above the level. They need to be shown how to do that. And all of the adults in their world can help them with that learning process. Another myth is that gifted students need to be only with other gifted students. This is a big one. In our district, and I'm going to get into it a little bit more, we have what is known as the cluster model, and that is very strategic and appropriate based on the research in gifted education. Standards, the national standards for gifted children talk about the priority that students have opportunities with are known as intellectual peers, and with what are known as age-appropriate peers. In a world where communication and collaboration are key skills, and we need to be able to learn those skills with all types of people. So having all of the gifted students separated is not necessarily the best choice at all times. So I do get that question a lot about like a pull-out program or something that is like, do they all go to a specific school or something like that? And that is not what we're about. Gifted students should do more work. Now, this is a myth, I think, sometimes for parents and teachers. So I try to help everyone to understand that the work doesn't need to be more. The work sometimes might need to be different, right? And in fact, we don't want interesting work that's appropriate for our students to be a punishment, right? Like do all of this and then you get to do this really cool thing, right? We want to differentiate that instruction and to help them to see those layers of how they might make the work different within what they're doing. So more is not always better. So we really want to think about students' interests in terms of what they're doing after school as well. This is a good one. Gifted students are well behaved. Not in my experience. So not always. That's one more for, that's more of a myth for teachers. Sometimes they are very rambunctious. Sometimes they have executive things going on. Sometimes they have a lot of questions. So we don't always see that. I'm still getting beeps, but I don't see anyone. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry. Okay, so that is, if you hear from your teacher that the child is misbehaving and you think, but he's gifted, how could he be misbehaving? It can be very normal. So gifted students must be fluent in English. That's another myth that is out there. Again, that could be more of a teacher myth than a parent myth, but I like to put that out there. So I'm going to go ahead and share, I'm sharing this slide with you about the characteristics of gifted learners. Now, this is from the body of research, right? So this is from different sources of research. These are common characteristics or attributes or traits that we see in gifted learners. No one person has all of these traits because some of them are, in conflict with each other, but you might see some traits as you're looking at this particular list that you have noticed in your own child, particularly recognizing complex patterns quickly. You might have noticed that in your young child. You might have seen this unusual ability to remember and recall large amounts of information, right? Where they tell you long stories about all of the things that have happened in their world. You also might see that intensity or sensitivity in terms of the affective characteristics. Real intensity towards a task or a problem that goes really deep, like they want to stay on it for a long time. And that could be, you know, building something with Legos. That could be building a world in Minecraft, but they want to stay with it for a really long time. I remember when my son was very young, and you know, your own child, you just kind of think like they do what they do. And then I would be with other parents and I'd be like, well, you know, in the afternoon we have like quiet time and he plays in his room and, you know, I do this and my husband does this. And they're like, how long does that last? I'm like, oh, like an hour. And they're like, what? He plays by himself for an hour, but he would. And I didn't know that I didn't necessarily think that focus, he would play with his train, whatever he was doing, and tell himself stories for a long time. I mean, it's not like we were far away, but the point is that he had that long attention span. So it would go for a long time. You probably have seen this strong moral compass or sense of justice in your children at this age in 2nd and 3rd grade. You get but it's not fair, and here's why, that kind of thing. They can get very upset about that. And that's something that we want to work with, especially as they get into in high school, so that they don't get a sense of what they call angst, where things that do not seem fair seem helpless. So we try to work through that. The advanced sense of humor, one of the characteristics that we see with younger children is that they get the jokes, right? That can be an indicator. They get the jokes that most kids don't get because they might be a little bit more mature jokes, or they get the sarcasm or the humor in something. And then that curiosity, lots of questions, you're probably seeing a lot of that as well. So, you know, this is just sort of the big picture of some of the characteristics. So if you're recognizing anything here, then that would be normal. Okay. So another thing that we really want to think about with our gifted students or children is this idea of what is known as asynchronous development. So in typical child development, we have the domains of social development, emotional development, physical development, and cognitive development. So in this graphic, the black line represents sort of a typical child, right? So they have these things known as, you know, Piaget stages of development, and kind of the standards and a lot of things in pedagogy are developed based on typical 7-year-old, typical 8-year-old, typical 9-year-old, right? Or these different stages and what they do. So we're talking about social, we're talking about peer interactions and collaboration. Emotional, we're talking about that risk-taking and sensitivity. Physical, fine motor, large motor skills. And then cognitive, the learning process, how they go about the learning process, and also that critical thinking piece. So what happens sometimes with students, gifted children, is that they can be asynchronous in this development. And this is what can be very challenging, and especially in the younger years. So that means that if I still have that, that's the typical 8-year-old, say, maybe this child, and this can go all different directions, but perhaps this particular child looks like an 11-year-old in terms of their critical thinking. So they're talking about stories, or they're making up stories and playing in a way that their peers are not necessarily connecting with or understanding. But perhaps their social interactions are looking a little bit more like a 5-year-old. So you don't understand what I'm saying, so I'm going to like get angry and cry, right? Or that would be in the emotional as well. Or I'm just going to run away from you and say, you're not my friend, or whatever. You know, they might have that kind of interaction that's actually a little bit delayed socially or emotionally, while their cognitives is over here. So they're kind of like fighting each other. This also happens in the physical domain. Many of our gifted students have issues with fine motor skills, for example. That's not uncommon, especially in gifted boys. at a young age. So if you're thinking right now, God, I can't stand it, his handwriting is so terrible, it's not necessarily abnormal to have that fine motor issue. So we can work on that in some of our younger gifted kids. Or large motor, right? Like there can be some clumsiness that happens. And some of that is my brain is moving faster than I can make my body move. So there's that asynchronicity. Now, again, this line could go different ways. We've seen gifted students who their emotional perceptions are really advanced, right? They notice all sorts of things in a classroom that other students don't notice, right? But their cognitive is on, it can go in different directions. So this is one of the things that we see in gifted kids that needs to be, where some of the needs are evident and need to be met. So in terms of how we do things in the classroom and then how we do things at home. So as a third grade teacher, it wasn't necessarily typical, for example, for students to cry when they got frustrated. That's not as typical in like a third, fourth grade class. Sometimes with gifted kids, that would happen more often because of that asynchronicity. So what do they need? Based on these characteristics and based on this asynchronicity, they need all of these various things. So I'm just going to talk about these elements for a little bit here. They need a safe environment at school or at home where they feel intellectually safe and socially and emotionally safe. They need flexibility and choice. This is really, really key as parents and as teachers, that our students get to have opportunities to indicate what they're into and be able to have choices in their decisions. And they might make a choice that doesn't actually doesn't actually get them, that later they decide they don't like that choice, and that's okay as well. I do think it's really important that our kids, our young students, students actually all the way through K-12 have opportunities to dabble in a lot of different areas of study. We don't need to decide that we're, violinists at age 3, and that's how they're defined all the way through, right? We have many students who have what is known as multi-potentiality. So they might be really good at a lot of stuff. I know you all probably knew some of these students, or maybe you were these students yourself in high school, and that's okay. They don't have to just do one thing. They can do a lot of different things, and eventually they'll figure that out in life, right? So our job is to give them lots of opportunities to try out a lot of different things. They need meaning making. And I mean that because I think it's about explicit meaning making. So sometimes there's a why, and sometimes we get a little bit like, oh my gosh, I can only take so many whys. But I have had, as an educator, I have stopped more often to describe the why in a really explicit way, whether it's on the process for why we're doing something, or how we're doing something, or what's happening next, or what does this mean in the sequence? What's the big idea of all of this with gifted students, more than students who struggle academically. They really want to know the whole picture. They want to see the big picture on things. Sometimes, especially when they're older, they need stress management. They can take it all in, especially if they have that perfectionism trait, which some gifted kids have. They need to be able to throw it away. I know I had a student once who was, I've never, in all the years, this was the most perfectionist student I'd ever had. And I mean, the level of detail that he put into things was unbelievable. But I had to break that in a way. Like I had to say, okay, this is something that you can spend the whole day on, and you can make it, I'll give you the whole day if you want to work on this thing, whether it's an art project or a piece of writing or something that we were doing. You can have the whole day, and at 3 o'clock, it's done. But then other times I just say, you have to do it really fast. You have to do it in 10 minutes, and it's going to be super messy, and I'm going to take it. Like I had to, because if not every single thing, he would go on and on and on and on to make it perfect, perfect, perfect. So I had to like to deal with that. And then it would become like a joke. And then he'd be like, is this one of those things I could take? You know, we would have to balance it out. So balance is really important. They need that explicit teaching sometimes of social skills and executive functioning skills. Executive functioning, like how to organize my stuff, right? I mean, my son is in 7th grade. He's pretty organized, but oh my God, every single day still, and I know you all experience that. Well, no, elementary don't experience it as much, but every single day, did you plug in your Chromebook? Did you plug in your Chromebook? Like every single night, I have to ask him that question. Or I find papers everywhere. I mean, it can be a challenge. So they need that explicit teaching of those skills. And also sometimes they need that very explicit teaching of social skills because of that asynchronicity. And we do that in the classroom as well as out of the classroom. Sometimes they need encouragement in those non-academic activities. So I might be super, super into coding or into science or math or these different things, but maybe, or reading, right? They might just want to read all the time, and that's great. And how about we go outside and do this thing? Or how about have, you know, let's have this other activity that's non-academic. They don't necessarily need add-ons of more academic activities after school, unless that's something that they really, really want to do. But if you're involved in an activity after school that they don't want to do, I would say it's not worth it. They also do really, really well with what is known as bibliotherapy, which means that the character in the book is experiencing the same of challenges that they are experiencing. So as teachers, we do a lot of like read alouds to the class, you know, that have bibliotherapy element. But there are a lot of really great books, and actually on my webpage, on the PUSD website, there's a link to some books that are particularly good for gifted kids. Reading, they really like to see themselves in. And we don't have to say like, this kid's just like you because he's gifted, but there are certain books that sort of lead to that. They obviously are really engaged by inquiry, letting them ask questions and ask questions, as well as that need to make connections, which kind of goes with the meaning making piece. So I'm going to move forward here. So I want to talk a little bit about enrichment versus differentiation. So differentiation is how we differ the instruction throughout the school day. And it has layers to it, so I'll get into that. But differentiation happens during the school day, bell to bell. So what happens in the classroom is differentiated for different types of learners. Okay, so there's differentiation that happens. There's certain like strategies in gifted and talented education that are engaged in whole group, but gifted students might access those questions and that way of thinking in a little bit different way. Okay, so when we talk about when I teach differentiation to teachers, it's about here are the elements that need to be in place for the whole group instruction to meet the needs of gifted learners. And there's some elements that might be in small group instruction or in individualized instruction. So all three of those are parts of differentiation, and that happens during the school day. When we talk about enrichment activities, we're talking about extracurricular weekends, after school activities. Sometimes in the differentiation, there might be something that leads to an enrichment as well, right? So there can be some enrichment during the school day. So there's some crossover there. So what I spend most of my energy on is helping teachers on the differentiation portion of gifted and talented education. And we have enrichment opportunities, okay? So it's happening in the class, bell to bell. So what does that look like in the classroom? So when we differentiate instruction, we might differentiate the content. You know, here's a particular story. We're reading, different stories, or we're looking at this, in readers workshop, we might have different students reading different books, but we might all be thinking about it in the same way. So we might all be looking for patterns in the book, but we might be reading different books. That might be a differentiation of the content. Or perhaps we're looking at a differentiation of the thinking skill. So now in that way, we might be reading the same book, but some students might be looking for patterns in that book, but then I might have other students proving the patterns rather than just identifying the patterns, or so other students perhaps relating the patterns in that book to patterns in another book. So we might all be looking at this book as a core text, but we might be differentiating our thinking on that text. And that would be the same thing if we're engaging in a science activity. Again, we might be differentiating the thinking. And a lot of that happens in the walking around in the classroom, especially with science activities. So it's the questions that the teacher's asking students to dig a little bit deeper or build depth and complexity assignment. So it's not always things that you're tangibly seeing, is what I'm saying, in the differentiation. There could be a differentiation in the product, what students produce to show what they know. There could be also differentiation in the process. How are we getting through the learning or going about the learning? So those are the ways in which we differentiate in the classroom. And we do that, we differentiate based on students' interests, based on students' needs, and based on students' abilities. So those are three kind of different ways of looking at differentiation. It's not all about ability. It could also be about interests. It could also be about particular needs, whether they be social, emotional, cognitive, physical, right? And interest-based differentiation might have nothing to do with giftedness, right? We might all, if we're doing a study of animal habitats and we say, okay, you can choose between, these 6 different habitats and that's how the groups are made, that's great. It's an interest-based differentiation tool, right? And you might have heterogeneous groups in terms of gifted and gifted students in that kind of environment, okay? So in terms of our board policy for GATE, it clearly indicates these 7 ways of looking at GATE structures. So we engage in all of these in our district in different ways. So there's part-time groupings in which students attend classes or seminars that are organized to provide that advanced or enriched subject matter as part of the school day. And those cluster groupings, okay, in which students are grouped within a regular classroom setting and receive appropriately differentiated activities from the regular classroom teacher. Most of the time, our ideal is that students are clustered in a classroom with a teacher who is GATE certified, okay? That means they've done training in gifted and talented education and they understand these processes. So that's the way that we organize it. So we don't want gifted students to be isolated. So we don't want, if there's 6 gifted students in 3rd grade at a school, we don't want like 1 here, 1 here, and 3 here, 2 here. Like we'd rather have 6 together or 3 and 3 so that there's a cluster. Again, so that there's opportunity with intellectual peers and opportunity with age appropriate peers. At some of our schools, we have a high percentage of gifted students. So every class has a cluster. And most of the teachers are GATE certified in those contexts. Independent study is our CIS program, basically, that takes students onto an individualized pathway. Acceleration means that they're placed in grade level classes that might be more advanced than their chronological age group. That happens more in secondary, and that's very purposeful. Again, I do believe strongly that students need to be with age appropriate peers. So we don't usually do a lot of grade skipping and those kinds of things unless it's really, really necessary, or we really think that that would be the right approach with the parent team. But in our secondaries, we do have students who, you know, especially in math, right? We have students who are taking math courses that are much accelerated. AP classes and then supplemental educational activities. So we're going to look at that again. So what I talk about a lot with our gate structures is that many of the things that we do in our classrooms are appropriate for all students, but they're essential for gate students. So these are sort of like 6 of the main pedagogical practices that I think must be present and that I work off of in terms of the professional development for teachers. Again, it's not going to hurt anyone to have these processes in the classroom, but they are essential for gifted students. So good for all, essential for gifted. So that's having this idea of interest-based pathways in the classroom, voice and choice, inquiry-based instruction, elements of social justice and activism that goes with that. It's just not fair characteristic, and then opportunities for depth and complexity, like I was starting to describe in my example with the book. So then I know this is me a lot talking because this is this kind of presentation, sorry. So when we look at the GATE standards, what we're talking about in terms of how we differentiate instruction for gifted students, there's 4 main categories in the GATE standards for curriculum and instruction. We talk about depth and complexity, we talk about acceleration, and we talk about novelty. So I'm going to give an example of that for you. But I do really like, and some of you might have seen this, well, you haven't been in the classrooms very much because everything's been virtual, but some of our teachers do use these prompts of depth and complexity. These are ways in which we think and ways in which we can think about any content, and they have symbols that go with them to help students identify the way that they're thinking and then transfer it to new contexts. So we have the prompts of depth and we have the prompts of complexity. So this is what I'm talking about for that differentiation on a particular book. We might all be reading the same book, but maybe I'm looking at patterns and trends in that book, and maybe another student is looking at the impact of this book on our class, on their peers. Another student might be looking at what was the motive? Why did the author write this book? Another student might be looking at what is this all about? How does this book relate to change or power or order? A big idea, right? Another student might be looking at how are we defining the rules in this book? Okay, now that's a lot. Usually we wouldn't have like everybody, but once the students get used to using the prompts of depth and complexity, they do apply them in their own contexts. And if you think about these words, you'll start to hear them out in the world when you're listening to the radio and different things. You'll hear reporters say, well, the ethical dilemma in this situation is, and the big idea is, and when we're looking at trends and patterns, like you start to hear that language, right? So, and all of this language is also it's really interesting when you look at like how like AP courses are designed and some of the IB courses and things like that at the high school level. They're looking at content through a lot of these lenses. So our goal, prompts of depth and complexity, is to get kids thinking in this way and making connections across disciplines from an early age. So when we're talking about acceleration, we're not necessarily just talking about, that word has been sort of used in a lot of different ways lately, coming back from COVID, but we're talking about acceleration of thought. So we're talking about when I'm looking at a particular piece of content, how can I think like a disciplinarian? So I'm going to show that in a minute. Look at it from different perspectives, or how does it relate to a larger idea or universal concept? And then in novelty, where you have that independent study piece, I don't mean independent study like this independent study school. I mean, like, I'm going to go on this journey of of a pathway of study because it interests me, right? And I'm going to develop this thing. It's kind of like we did with, some of you were involved in innovation exposition and innovation clubs. That's a lot about independent study, right? They're going down a pathway of interest and developing a project. It's about student choice. It's about critical and creative thinking. So it's like all of the GATE standards in like 3 minutes, which I mean, I'm going to do a 5-day workshop after school gets out for teachers on this. So 3 minutes is pretty quick, but that gives you the big picture of what we're talking about. We're talking about differentiation. So I'm going to give an example. So now is the time where you can participate, please. So I would love for you in the chat to just write down what you notice or what you wonder looking at these two images in front of you. What do you notice? What do you wonder? What questions does it bring up? Is it natural or not? Are they the same place? Is it climate change? What happened? Same place, different. Okay, so some people notice that it looks like the same place, but it looks different. We're in trouble. There's an inference made already. I notice the mountains are a different color in the 2-1. The same lake has dried up. It's drought. How much time has elapsed? That's a great question. I notice what's on the left. Is this normal or is it seasonal? Water has disappeared. Is it drought? I wonder why the left-hand image is more vibrant, just looking at it through an artistic lens. Is it a reservoir? Will there be a dust problem? Just thinking about cause and effect here, health impacts. There's water, but then there is not. Was this edited? Looking at it from perspective of who's taking the picture. Good. What happened to living things in the water? Is this nearby? Okay, good. So this is the notice and wonder. So this is a strategy that we're using across the district with any kind of what we would call puzzlement or phenomena that's presented to students. All students notice and wonder things, right? And our gifted students deeply notice and wonder things, and they need opportunity to notice and wonder, and they need opportunity to ask questions from all different perspectives. With the notice and wonder, we take in. We don't necessarily comment on or judge the different notices and wonderings. You might have noticed I said things like, oh, that's from this perspective, or that's from this perspective, but I wasn't saying, you know, that it's just taking it all in. So next thing I might see, where do you see change in these pictures? So let's be really detailed. What do you see that has changed specifically in the picture? And you can add. The hills have changed, the water level, the mountains. And I might say what specifically on the mountains have changed. The dock is damaged in the second. There's no snow in the mountains. The dock seems broken. That makes me wonder, right? That adds to another wondering. So I might write that other question that comes out. The color has faded. Your perspective has changed the longer you look at them. We know that most of the time people, okay, when people, now I lost my train of thought, sorry, because there was a comment that was not related to the lesson part. So we see different change elements there. So change is one of our universal themes. So change, order, power, structure are things that we can relate across disciplines. We can look for change in multiple contexts. So just that question in adds for some layers of thinking and looking in depth. Oh, I know what I was going to say. We know from arts education research that most people don't spend under 30 seconds looking at any particular thing. So people walk through museums and just like really go by, but to really observe, to really notice and wonder, you have to spend more than 30 seconds. So we've already been more than 30 seconds looking at these images, and you could see that that more things are from that. Okay. So another level, another layer to this, I might say, I might present this statement, this big idea that change could be natural or person-made. And I might say, what in the change that you see do you think is natural change, and what change might be person-made and why, right? So maybe this is a study of drought or climate change or change in our environment in California. And we're going to prove now with evidence what that change can be natural or person-made. And in some cases, it could be both. So now we might have some supporting documentation to be reading and find out more about this location. Okay, so that would be an example of accelerating the thought on a particular scientific phenomena. So as we differentiate the thinking skill using the prompts of depth and complexity, we might be describing what we see or reasoning with what we see or justifying what we see or explaining what we see. And with that, we're looking at language of the discipline in science, and we're going to be looking at details, we're going to be looking at patterns, context, we're going to be proving, and we're going to be processing. So all of that goes into that critical thinking and depth and complexity element. And not everyone has to be looking at the same study through the same lens. The exposure can be to all, and some are going to go deeper, right? So some students might be describing what they see, and other students might be justifying or proving what they see. Another layer to that, I'm just giving you like the 101 of developing a gifted differentiation lesson or unit. Another layer to that might be that perspective, thinking like a disciplinarian. So when we looked at these two pictures, or maybe we go back to these two images, how might a geologist study these images, and how might that be different than a sociologist studying these images? So maybe we're looking at what are the different disciplines in science and in the humanities, and how do people, what are they studying? And so then what would they be studying in these pictures? Well, that's not all happening in one day and 1 minute. These are the layers of elements that we can bring into the instruction, okay? So that's the, from the chart that had the 4 things, kind of giving you a real example if we were studying drought in California, okay? So in our elementary schools, the differentiation happens in groupings. It happens in independent pathways, interest-based independent pathways. We have some curriculum compacting that happens in math. That means I already know this, so I'm doing this, right? So we're compacting it. That happens especially in, with iReady and then differentiated groups in the classroom. We have readers and writers workshop, which is automatically very differentiated as students work whole group, small group, and independently. We layer in depth, complexity, novelty, and acceleration. We layer in inquiry, layer in voice and choice, arts integration, so we can relate things across disciplines. And then we have teacher PD and research happening. In our middle schools and high schools, we offer International Baccalaureate at one of our secondary schools, which is very much in line. The whole philosophy of International Baccalaureate is very much the tenets of gifted education. So that is a pathway. We offer AP courses and honors courses that allow opportunities for those intellectual. Math is very compacted in middle school. If you're in the honors track of math in middle school, you're basically doing 3 years of math in 2 years, so that you start high school math in 8th grade. And then if you're in honors in high school, starting in 8th grade, then you're compacting 3 years, math 1, math 2, and math 3 into 2 years. So there's compacting through the honors program in math. There's also Math Academy, which is radical acceleration. Okay, I don't want you all to think that my kid's really good at math, so he should be in Math Academy. Not true. Math Academy is like a very small percentage. It's what's known as radical acceleration. They're doing all of middle and high school math in 3 years. So they end with calculus BC at the end of 8th grade. So it's for a very small percentage of students. So don't think that your child failed if they didn't make it into Math Academy. Our curriculum compacting in math in the honors track is very appropriate for a lot of our students. And also, you know, you have to go also with what kids are into and what they like. So just because they're eligible doesn't mean that that's always the best choice either, depending on their other interests. We have academies and electives that help hone in on the interest in secondary. We have, in some cases, GATE advisory classes. So in middle school, the advisory is a thing. Sometimes we have advisories that are GATE. We have junior docent opportunities in middle school, and we have a lot of leadership opportunities in ASB and clubs that our gifted students get involved with. I said as part of our work in the GATE program is professional development for teachers. So we have sort of these layers of PD that happen with our teachers offered to all. We have district-wide PD offerings and a Monday PD offerings. Like I said, in June, I'm doing a week-long PD for teachers. We have some individualized instruction at specific schools that's happening on tier 2. And then we have individualized leadership opportunities where teachers attend the California Association for the Gifted Teacher Institute, or administrators have attended their Administrator Institute. We have Educator Institutes at USC, the LA City Symposium, and we do some one-on-one coaching and learning walks. So those pieces are together. In terms of enrichment, we have supplemental educational activities at some of our schools. Some schools' GATE clubs, Destination Imagination, or IE clubs that happen just right now, at school level. We also have innovation clubs district-wide. We had Innovation Exposition that just happened. We have Math Field Day. We have GATE Enrichment Evenings and Parent Education, Science Olympiad, Spelling Bee, No Boundaries, our art exhibition, African American History Bee, art and essay contests throughout the year for women's history and Armenian history, Dia de los Muertos, MLK, all of those things. And we have a student think tank in high school, which is really incredible, where students are helping to guide decisions made in PUSD. And that's not only for gifted students, but I have noticed that a lot of the kids who have been interested in being on the think tank and who are taking leadership in that because of the way it's structured and what it's doing, it's a very social justice oriented group, tend to be kids who were identified as gifted. So it's a great opportunity for them. So we want to think throughout this whole thing, we're thinking about the whole child. We're thinking about their social and emotional and physical and cognitive needs. So sometimes when parents are concerned about various in the classroom, I say, is your child happy? So the first thing is, do they come home from school happy? The second thing is, do they have a friend? If the answer is no, and not because you've prodded them, but because they genuinely are not happy and they tell you, and I don't have any friends, then we have real need for concern, and we want to figure out some things going on there. But if they're generally happy in school, then things are probably generally going pretty well. We as adults, as parents, we do not know what happens every minute in the classroom. We just do not. If I only went off of what my child tells me happens in school each day, I would think that is learning nothing and doing nothing, right? And that's been the same since he was in kindergarten. So, we have to be able to, know that there's a lot of things happening that are unseen. And with our younger children, that really comes out in how they express themselves emotionally coming out of school. So this is where I can be reached on Twitter. I'm Maestra Anderson. I was a dual language teacher exclusively, so I still have Maestra Anderson. I was a teacher, and then at PUSD Arts is across all social media. And then the GATE page, I do encourage you to go there. There's a lot of past parent presentations. There's a lot of links to resources on the GATE page. So on our website. So I do encourage you to go there. Yes, every school does have someone who is a GATE site representative. In a lot of cases, that is the instructional coach. So that is who you can always go to with questions if they're specific. I would always start with the teacher, start with the instructional coach, start, and then going to the principal and then come to me, right? Unless there's some kind of question, I mean, I'm happy to answer a question, but sometimes if you email me, I might say, please talk to, and the person is to talk to at the school site, right? Because your child I don't know your children, right? They know your children because they see them in the classroom all the time. You'd be amazed. I've been an instructional coach, and I've been an administrator, and I did know all of the kids in that school. So you will see that. The other thing I will comment on, because I see this question about class. So class sizes, we're 1 to 25 in K3 and 1 to 35 in 4th and 5th grade. That is the law in California. So that's where we are. And class size has not necessarily been proven to have a huge impact on the instructional outcomes. Teacher differentiation and teacher process has more to do with the instructional outcomes. So, and that's the other thing that's hard, right? Some of you, I think in this room are educators, but if you're not, it is kind of really hard to imagine how you differentiate instruction with kids, but there are ways that we do it. And that's why I wanted to give an example that was that was the whole group way, because we're thinking about that picture in different ways, those images, based on the prompting that I gave. And then we can take it to another level, right? So I wanted to give you an example that was a little bit broader. Also on my website, there are some books that you might be interested in. I put them at the end of here, and this I'll put up there on the webpage as well with the recording. So you can go back through the slides if there's things that you wanted to get at. Into the, for different resources for you as parents. The California Association for the Gifted website and the National Association for Gifted Children, NAGC website, both also have really great resources for parents for all of that. So with that, I went a little bit over. So I think some of my Spanish speaking parents are waiting patiently. So I just wanted to give that to you. So yes, if you have individual questions, please let me know or go ahead and talk to specific people at your school. There have been questions about the scores from the test. We don't necessarily send them out globally, and it's not necessarily important. It's not going to, you saw that the initial identification was above 90th percentile. I mean, it's not necessarily going to tell you anything more other than that. We don't send them out globally because they require context, right? So if you thing that says 67, 72, 54, you might think, oh my God, my child's got 54% on something, but it's not, it's percentile, and that's totally normal. So we don't, we just don't do it that way. They are available. Your gate site rep at your school can give, but if you already are identified, it's not really important. Oh, thank you, Patty, instructional coach at Don Benito. She said she's looking forward to attending the 5-day training. Thank you for asking that question, Nellie. Your child does not need to know. It doesn't need to be a big thing. Like, you don't need to talk about that they're gifted or that they're in this special program or that they're different than anyone else. It's more about supporting their needs. You don't have to hide it from them, but I don't think that they really think about it. It's more that the teachers need to know, right, from here, so that we can appropriately meet those needs. Okay. So thank you for the question. And we really don't want that I'm in it, you're not thing, that makes that star-bellied Sneetch thing. That's not what it's about. Okay, thank you. So that is the end of the English session. So I appreciate you here, and we will say bye. And I'm going to let in some of these other people. And thank you so much.